The Thousand Sons are one of the traitor legions of Chaos Space Marines who are sworn solely to the service of Tzeentch, the Chaos God of Change, Intrigue, and Sorcery, though they were once the Imperium of Man's X-Myth Legion of Space Marines. The main feature that distinguishes the Thousand Sons from the other traitor legions is the sheer number of psyker mutations that have always existed amongst the Space Marines in this legion. Every current member of the Legion possesses psychic abilities, and they prefer to use chaos sorcerers and guile in combat, relying on their psychic powers and sorceress knowledge to earn them victory. As a result of an ancient spell known as the Rubric of Ahriman that was cast soon after the Thousand Sons fell from their homeworld of Prospero during the early days of the Horus Heresy, every Thousand Sons Astartes that lacked psychic powers had his soul fused directly into his power armor. The Thousand Sons have become living embodiments of sorcery, animated by the power of chaos and the will of the Lord of Change. The Thousand Sons are the scions of the Primarch Magnus the Red, the copper-skinned Cyclops, whose thirst for knowledge in all its forms led ultimately to damnation and an eternity of servitude to Tzeentch, the chaos god known as the Changer of the Ways. When the Primarchs were scattered throughout the galaxy, Magnus found himself coming to rest upon the distant, isolated colony world of Prospero. It was perhaps fortunate that a being that many other human societies would have denounced as a mutant came to such a place. Prospero's only inhabitants were a population of outcast scholars and mystics who had long since fled the galaxy at large to establish a refuge where they could practice the arts of the psyker. Raised by such scholars, Magnus learned and mastered every one of their arts, soon surpassing them in every regard. The Primarch turned from pupil to master, his fearsomely powerful mind able to manipulate the raw power of the warp in ways no others could. By the time the Emperor located his long-lost son, Magnus was privy to every secret the libraries of Prospero could offer. He yearned to learn more, and in his sire found the only being with more psychic potential than he. Accepting command of the Space Marine Legion created using his own gene stock, Magnus took his place in the Great Crusade and utilized his puissant skills for the good of all mankind. But all was not well with this state of affairs, for the Imperium of Man had been envisaged as an end to the superstitions that had benighted the isolated worlds of mankind for so many long millennia. The worship of deities and fallacious spiritual doctrines was denounced by the Emperor's iterators, who preached a new age of reason fueled by the potential of humanity itself and the doctrines of the imperial truth. Sorcery had no place in such a society, yet was not the Emperor the greatest of all psychers? A great debate raged in the upper echelons of the nascent Imperium, driven by the need to explain and harness the phenomenon of psychic power whilst putting an end to sorcery and superstition. While still comparatively rare, the number of humans being born with latent psychic powers was increasing, though it was nowhere near so prevalent as it is in the late 41st millennium. The phenomenon proved all but impossible to explain using the empirical reasoning on which the Imperium was being built, and eventually, a great convocation of the highest-ranked and wisest counselors in the Imperium was called. At this Council of Nikaea, those who denounced the use of psychic powers stated their case, the Emperor himself enthroned in judgment. At length, Magnus came before the council, and gifted as he was of the intellect and charisma of a Primarch, he refuted each of their points. Furthermore, Magnus stated convincingly his belief that no knowledge was in itself forbidden, so long as the scholar used it wisely. Both parties having made their cases and the judgment appearing to hang in the balance, the Emperor made his decision, partially influenced by his anger towards Magnus's continued use of sorcery to bargain with the entities of the warp, despite the Emperor's repeated warnings to his son of the dangers that lay within the immaterium. The pursuit of psychic powers would be severely limited and strictly controlled, and any incarnation of ritual, superstition, or incantation outlawed entirely. Magnus was furious, for the Emperor's pronouncement severely curtailed his legion's activities and denied them the use of their most potent weapons of war. And so the Great Crusade continued onwards, but it later became apparent that Magnus had not ceased the pursuit of the forbidden arts at all, but rather had continued it beyond the sight of his peers. Most opposed of all his brother Primarchs was Leman Russ, who regarded any form of guile used to defeat an enemy as a form of cowardice, and even after the pronouncements of Nikaea, a bitter resentment smoldered between the legions. It was during the opening phase of the Horus Heresy that this resentment exploded into something far worse, with tragic consequences for the Imperium. On the eve of the War Master Horus's treachery, Magnus is said to have experienced a vision in which he saw as no others could the full extent of the galactic civil war to come, and the part each Primarch would come to play in it. He saw brother slaying brother and pacts being sealed with unspeakable beings. He saw the Ultramarines being unknowingly steered far beyond any hope of intervening, and worst of all, he saw what fate awaited the Emperor himself. Yet, the one thing Magnus could not see was his own role in the coming war, but he determined to intervene nonetheless. Magnus knew that in warning his sire of the coming treachery, he would be admitting that he had disobeyed the edicts of Nikaea, yet he believed he had no choice. Furthermore, he saw that with events unfolding so fast, the only sure way of warning the Emperor was to project his consciousness across the void, breaching the psychic defenses of the Imperial Palace, and to appear before his sire in spirit form. The Primarch of the Thousand Sons issued his warning, but in so doing revealed his own crime. In a stroke, Magnus was condemned by the Emperor, for his message had breached the psychic defenses of the Imperial Palace and catastrophically destabilized the Emperor's Webway project to build an Imperial extension into the Webway for humanity. Terra itself was now at risk of demonic invasion through the breach created by Magnus's folly. The Space Wolves were dispatched to Prospero by the Emperor to call the Thousand Sons to account and bring Magnus back to Terra to answer for his acts. Yet what followed must surely have been far more destructive than any, even Magnus, could have foreseen. Manipulated by the War Master Horus, who was already plotting his rebellion against the Emperor, the Space Wolves fell upon Prospero as savage barbarians, unleashing their bestial anger on the Thousand Sons and all of their works. The delicate silver towers of the so-called City of Light, Tizca, were cast down as brother fought brother, savage fought scholar, and warrior fought mystic. At the height of the destruction, Leman Russ and Magnus met one another in bitter conflict, and ultimately Russ proved the stronger of the brother Primarchs. Yet, at the very moment of Russ's triumph, Magnus uttered a word of power and caused himself and the City of Light to vanish from the surface of Prospero, disappearing into the warp to reappear later within the depths of the Eye of Terror, on what would come to be known as Sortiarius, the planet of the sorcerers. Given the heritage of their Primarch, it can be no surprise that the Thousand Sons Legion was always prone to mutation. Prior to the heresy, stringent purity checks and relentless discipline had kept mutation at bay, whilst simultaneously developing psychic power. Having steeped themselves in the raw power of chaos, however, the Thousand Sons fell prey to rampant and uncontrolled mutation, to such an extent that a cabal of the Legion's senior librarians, led by their chief, Ahriman, determined that something drastic must be done to save the Legion from complete dissolution. With Magnus retired to the highest tower of his reshaped City of Light, his mystic, all-seeing gaze cast bitterly upon the dimensions without, Ahriman and his cabal set about enacting a mighty spell that would purge the Legion of mutation and impurity, and leave behind a body of utterly purified warriors. Ahriman cast his rubric, and the skies over the planet of the sorcerers erupted in an etheric storm of unprecedented proportions. Bolts of power formed from the raw stuff of the warp, arced from the roiling clouds, each striking a battle brother of the Thousand Sons, until all but Magnus in his tower and the cabal of sorcerers had been scoured by the mighty rubric. But when the storm receded, Ahriman saw the awful truth of what he had wrought. Instead of purging the flesh of ravening mutations, each of the Thousand Sons who lacked psychic power had been transformed. The seals and joints of their power armor had been welded shut, and the body within turned to ashes. What remained was a suit of animated armor, devoid of mutation, but of all independent will as well. When Magnus the Red saw what Ahriman had done, he turned his back, ascended his tower, and turned his gaze upon the Imperium. In that moment, he knew that everything he had ever striven towards was now, quite literally, ashes. Some say that Magnus resides in his silver tower still, his baleful gaze sweeping the domains of mankind in search of the means of enacting his final vengeance. While their demon Primarch broods upon the total annihilation of his enemies, the sorcerers of the Thousand Sons lead their automaton warriors, their Rubrici, the length and breadth of the galaxy, wielding the power of Tzeentch and enacting the schemes of their master upon the Imperium. The Space Marines of the Emperor's Legions Astartes were genetically engineered, psycho-indoctrinated warriors with superhuman abilities and minds and souls for war. In addition, each individual legion had its own idiosyncrasies and character, the product of their gene seed and unique warrior culture. The Thousand Sons were a Space Marine legion bound up with occult lore, mysticism, and the otherworldly powers of the Psyker. It was these esoteric arts of war that made them one of the most formidable legions, but also one of the most distrusted, and would eventually see them subjected to the Emperor's judgment against them. Like all of their predecessors among the Legiones Astartes, the Extinct's 5th Space Marine Legion was first forged on Terra by the Emperor of Mankind, and its original members were recruited from the Terran population. Their gene seed was first derived from samples of the psychically gifted DNA of their genetic father Magnus the Red, and then implanted into the first Thousand Sons Astartes in the gene laboratories of Luna during a brief resurgence of warp storms within the boundaries of the Sol system. This brief surge of warp activity generated psychic convergences all across the globe, resulting in spontaneous outbreaks of psychotic violence. This unusual activity likely did not have any additional mutational effect on the Legion's gene seed. However, upon learning of these ominous events years later, after he was given command of the Legion following his discovery by the Emperor on the world of Prospero, the Primarch Magnus considered these portents as boding ill for his Legion. The initial core of Thousand Sons legionaries, the student aspirants, had been chosen from psychically gifted individuals who had been citizens of the former Achaemenid Empire that had existed on Terra and had been ruled by the Emperor for nearly a standard century. Because they had been under imperial rule for so long, the Achaemenids had not suffered as greatly as other regions of the planet during the Emperor's unification wars to reunite all the various techno-barbarian tribes and nation-states of the Earth under his rule. The student aspirants of the Extinctth Legion had been chosen from among those Achaemenid families the Emperor himself had determined showed potential and were suitable for the gene seed implantation process. These young men were taken from the territory of the Achaemenid Empire to the Emperor's secret gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, where he first had begun his experiments in human enhancement and created the Primarchs to begin the student aspirants' transformation into Space Marines. One of these first student aspirants was Azek Ahriman and his twin brother, Ormuzd Ahriman. Once it had been raised, the X-5th Legion was deployed by the Emperor to gain experience through the suppression of the few remaining pockets of techno-barbarian resistance on Terra to imperial rule. Having proved themselves in this first campaign, the X-5th was formally named the Thousand Sons by the Emperor and given their own expeditionary fleet so that they might begin to make contributions to the Great Crusade the Emperor had unleashed to reunify all of humanity within the newborn Imperium of Man. The world of Prospero was, as records report, originally a place of pure desolation. It was a desolate, dark planet and was chosen by its original inhabitants because of its sheer distance from Terra. Mutants and psychers lived in reclusion and study on the world, safe from the prejudice and hatred of their fellow humans. In the end, the only good thing about Prospero was its galactic position as a backwater and the reality that it was an easy world to hide on. It had one major city, Tizca, the City of Light, a gleaming metropolis of white marble with spires reaching into the sky. Tizca was situated on the most central of the many mountains of the planet, and it was nourished by underground hydroponics and techno-psychic collectible arrays that provided sustainable energy. All of its towers were gleaming works of architectural grace, defined by soaring obelisks and towering pyramids. Within Tizca, the mutant psychic outcasts of human society devoted themselves completely to the study of their psychic abilities in order to master their powers. Thus, Magnus could freely develop his own full psychic potential far from the sight of other men. Time passed, and Magnus went from student to adept, and from adept to master. When he reached adulthood, someone whose coming he had long foreseen finally arrived on Prospero, the Emperor of Mankind. As legend tells, the two recognized each other immediately. The Emperor, of course, acknowledged the psychic giant to be one of his long-lost sons, and granted Magnus the command of the Thousand Sons Space Marine Legion that had been created from his own genetic profile. Bearing Magnus's gene seed, the Ex-Sefeth Legion had a strong predisposition towards psychic mutation, and a considerable number of Thousand Sons Astartes inherited their Primarch's potent psychic capabilities. Approximately 5 standard years after the Thousand Sons began the Great Crusade to reclaim and reunify the human-settled galaxy, the Thousand Sons began to display powerful psychic abilities, which was at first a welcome development for its Astartes, as they sought to further emulate the Emperor. This development was reluctantly tolerated by the Emperor, who was greatly wary of psychic abilities wielded by anyone other than himself or Malcador the Sigillite, because the Thousand Sons' abilities proved to be a powerful weapon for the Imperium during the Great Crusade. Throughout that long campaign, the Thousand Sons made extensive use of sorcerers, and their warp-derived powers would leave whole populations in thrall to their will, rather than carrying out a planetary conquest through a costly full frontal assault like the other Space Marine legions. This tactic earned the ire of Leman Russ of the Space Wolves Legion, who saw anything less than a frontal assault as dishonorable and cowardly. But soon, the Legion's joy at their psychic gifts turned to revulsion and horror, as a wave of ghastly degenerative mutations began to affect large portions of the Battle Brothers of the 15th Legion. These mutagenic changes began to be called the Flesh Change by the Legionaries, and were much feared, as the spiral of degenerative mutation ultimately reduced a proud Thousand Sons Astartes into a mindless mutant abomination that would later be recognized by the Imperium as a gibbering chaos spawn. The majority of those afflicted by the Flesh Change were put into stasis by the Legion in the hope that someday, in the future, a cure would be able to be found to reverse the onset of these crippling mutations. The number of active Astartes within the Ex-Eth Legion soon began to dwindle to dangerously low levels as a result of the ravages of the Flesh Change. Fortunately for the Ex-Tieth Legion, the Emperor's Great Crusade finally arrived at the isolated world of Prospero, and the Thousand Sons were reunited with their Primarch Magnus. The Flesh Change had become a pandemic at this point, but the entire Legion was transported to the newly discovered world to meet their Gene Father. After the initial reunion with one of his lost sons and the celebrations that followed, the Emperor and the vast majority of the Great Crusade's large fleet departed Prospero, leaving the Thousand Sons behind. By then, the rampant mutations within the Legion had spontaneously gone out of control after the departure of the Emperor. The Thousand Sons Primarch Magnus intervened to save his genetic children, and through mysterious means was able to save those that had been the least affected by the rampant mutations. In the end, the Ex-Fifth Legion only numbered 1,000 battle brothers that had managed to be saved. The Thousand Sons gene seed had been stabilized, and the recruitment of potential initiates from Prospero began to replenish the Legion's severely depleted ranks. The Ex-Fifth Legion was eventually able to rebuild its numbers, though the Thousand Sons Legion would never become as large as its fellow legions, and return to the Great Crusade, led by their Primarch Magnus. Using their psychic gifts, the resurgent Thousand Sons Legion brought a number of worlds into Imperial compliance, bringing them into the Imperial fold. Their primary methods of victory included the use of diplomatic guile and trickery, a modus operandi that was not questioned by the rest of the Imperium. But these methods grew less effective as the 60th Legion's expeditionary fleet entered more dangerous regions of unknown space where extensive hostile forces were encountered. Many of these new enemies of mankind employed psychic powers similar to those that the Thousand Sons wielded. The 16th Legion used their own potent psychic gifts and sorceress abilities to bring these enemies of mankind into compliance or to exterminate them altogether. Over the following solar decades, some of the Primarchs voiced their dissent that these so-called Psyker legionaries were allowed to exist and be a part of the Emperor's righteous Great Crusade. The Arc Reach cluster had been discovered by the Word-Bearers Legion's 47th Expeditionary Fleet. It was a group of binary stars occupied by a number of belligerent planetary empires that rejected the Imperium's offer to become part of the Emperor's growing demesne. When negotiations broke down between Imperial representatives and the Phoenix Court, a representative body of 6 systems of the Arc Reach cluster, hostilities commenced. The first 4 systems easily fell to the combined efforts of the Space Wolves and the Word-Bearers. The rout waged a genocidal campaign that laid waste to the intransigent worlds, while the Word-Bearers' Ashen Circle destroyed much of the culture of the Arc Reach cluster, hunting down works of false doctrine and those who pervade it, and consigning both to destruction and eradicating flame. The 2 legions continued the prosecution of this campaign for the next 2 years until only 2 worlds still resisted Imperial efforts, thanks in no small part to the Avenians, who lived in silver towers on top of the tallest mountain peaks of Arc Reach Secundus, which was known to the local inhabitants as Heliosa. It was soon decided that in order to ensure a successful compliance, a greater Imperial presence must be felt. To this end, Leman Russ decided that he would send for assistance from Thousand Sons in the nearby Agoru system to help bring the 6th and final world, Shrike, into Imperial compliance. When the 15th Legion finally arrived, they found themselves deployed at a more frantic war pace than what they were accustomed to. The Space Wolves' compliance operations were conducted swiftly, and over the next 6 months, the rout continued to spearhead the efforts on Shrike. The Imperial ground forces found themselves being viciously attacked by varied and hostile avian creatures almost incessantly, which forced the Imperials to modify their weapons for point defense in order to clear the skies around them. These vicious avians were known by the local inhabitants as snow shrikes, razor-beaked birds, that made short work of the Imperial forces during multiple assaults. This earned the planet the sobriquet, Shrike, by Imperial forces. Despite the punishing pace of the campaign, the Thousand Sons helped play an instrumental role in the final defeat over the Avenians when they took the objective named Raven's Eyrie 93. This final battle was won in a matter of hours, with only a fraction of casualties incurred by Imperial forces. The Avenian surviving leaders and military forces withdrew and retreated to their capital world of Heliosa. With the precognitive abilities of the Thousand Sons Corvide cult members, they were able to determine the location of hidden enemy forces, whom the Space Wolves savagely killed with their warriors, while the Word-Bearers burned their fortresses with purifying flame. Even after achieving victory, tensions between the Space Wolves and the Thousand Sons continued to boil over until it finally came to a head during the battle for Phoenix Craig, Shrike's capital city. The Crimson King had become disgusted by what he saw as the wanton destruction and near genocide committed by the Space Wolves of the planet's population. The Space Wolves pointed out to their cousin Legion that the Avenians were an unrepentant and degenerate society who refused to accept the Imperial truth. Soon tensions flared, and several of the Space Wolves charged the Thousand Sons. The warriors of the 15th Legion utilized their deadly psychic abilities and slew several Fenrisian wolves, as well as disabling the bodies of the Space Wolves themselves. In the midst of the fighting, disaster struck in the form of one of the Thousand Sons, a Pavoni cult member known as Haster, when he succumbed to the dreaded flesh change after overexerting his psychic powers. This caused his body to spontaneously mutate uncontrollably, which caused panic within the ranks of the Thousand Sons and resulted in further mutations amongst some of its members. A surging wave of power erupted as Magnus the Red came forth and stepped towards the hideously transformed Hastur, who seemed to reach out to Magnus as though to embrace him, and the Primarch opened his arms to receive him with forgiveness and mercy. Suddenly, a thunderous bang sounded, and Hastar's body exploded as a single explosive round detonated within his chest. Silence ascended as the heavy tink sound of a monstrous expended brass casing struck the ground. It was the Wolf King himself who had ended Hastur's suffering. The Wolf King walked calmly towards his brother Primarch as both sides readied themselves to make war upon one another. Total war between the two legions seemed imminent. Fortunately, disaster was just barely averted when Primarch Lorgar interposed himself between his brothers and through his masterful oratory managed to calm the tense situation. Magnus refused to stand by as the wolves ravaged Heliosa, but Russ retorted that this world was discovered by his legion, and therefore it was his to do with as he saw fit. The people of this world had chosen to fight the Imperium, and therefore had chosen death. As the Wolf King departed, he turned to face Magnus once more and swore a blood oath against the Crimson King, promising that one day soon there would be a reckoning between both of them. The Wolf King then slashed his blade across his palm and let his blood spill to the ground. He then threw his head back and howled, and his warriors added their voices to their master's cry, a lament for the dead and grim warning of things to come. Rumors and condemnations began to spread about the Thousand Sons Legion amongst the other expeditionary fleets. The most vocal of these detractors were the Primarchs of the Death Guard, Imperial Fists, and Raven Guard legions. The majority of the legionaries of the 18th Legion had been afflicted by the rampant genetic mutation within their ranks. Those that still remained unafflicted had seen their psychic abilities increase dramatically in power level. Soon the Thousand Sons detractors raised their objections to the Emperor himself, calling for the 18th Legion's disbandment and for the Legion to be expunged from the Imperial records, like the Seku and Eventh Legions. The Emperor was also displeased by the Thousand Sons' dabblings in manipulating the corrupting powers of the warp. Serious suspicions began to surround Magnus as the hatred towards mutants and psychers spread through the Imperium as the Crusade progressed, and the legions learned how dangerous the use of psychic abilities could be on world after world that had been ravaged by them during the Age of Strife. After much debate in the Imperium over the use of psychers, the Emperor called an imperial conclave of all the Primarchs and chief imperial officials at the remote and volatile planet of Nikaea to deal with the issue once and for all. The highest authorities in the young Imperium were present or were represented, including the Emperor and his Sigillite and Regent Malkador, who officiated over the council. At the forefront of the debate was Magnus, who argued very passionately for his cause and the important contributions that psychers and the use of sorcery could make to the improvement of the Imperium and to speeding up the successful conclusion of the Great Crusade. The main opponents to the use of psychers were the Space Wolves, who shared their Primarch Leman Russ's hatred of sorcery as unclean and cowardly, and the Death Guard, whose Primarch Mortarion testified in person against the use of psychic powers. When a consensus emerged among the Council's participants that psychers and their powers represented a potential danger to the people of the Imperium, the Emperor's edicts were that in the interest of unity, no one was to be censured for prior actions involving the use of psychic abilities. Use of psychic abilities by the Imperium's military forces was banned, except the use of astropaths, navigators, and very strictly sanctioned and controlled psychers who were authorized to carry out imperial business, like the Sisters of Silence. All Astartes Legion librarians were to be disbanded, and their members returned to conventional combat duty. In effect, Magnus and the Thousand Sons were banned from practicing sorcery or using the psychic abilities and knowledge they so coveted. However, while fighting in the Great Crusade, The Thousand Sons would secretly gather the sacred texts and forbidden research into psychic phenomena of several thousand conquered worlds and compile them into the infamous tome of sorcery known as the Book of Magnus. When Magnus the Red learned of Horus's betrayal of the Imperium and his decision to give his loyalty to the ruinous powers, he used his own psychic abilities to get a message to the Imperial Palace on Terra by directly contacting the Emperor mind to mind. Though this ruptured the palace's considerable psychic defenses and killed thousands of people whose minds were unable to handle Magnus's potent psychic call. But the Emperor refused to believe that his favorite son Horus would ever betray his trust, and so he assumed that it was Magnus who had been corrupted by the Chaos Gods, since he was once again using the sorcerous powers that had been banned by the Council of Nikaea. Believing that Magnus sought to sow dissension in the Imperium to serve his masters in the warp, the Emperor ordered the Space Wolves Legion to go to Prospero and bring back Magnus to Terra, so he could give account for his actions. But this was not to be, as the corrupted War Master Horus had intercepted the Emperor's communique with Russ's Legion and subtly manipulated their orders. Instead of just arresting the offending Primarch Magnus for his transgressions and bringing him back to the Emperor for censure and punishment for breaking his oath never to use his psychic powers again, Horus changed their orders to read that the Space Wolves were to assault the Thousand Sons' homeworld of Prospero. Magnus had psychically foreseen the Loyalist Marines' attack on Prospero, which was eventually carried out by the Space Wolves Legion, elements of the Emperor's Adeptus Custodes, and millions of Imperial army troops, all assisted by the Sisters of Silence, acting as psychic blanks in order to nullify the Thousand Sons' psychic abilities. Magnus had finally understood, after his forced psychic entry into the Hall of the Golden Throne and his direct mental communication with the Emperor, that he had been manipulated by Tzeentch, with whom he had apparently unknowingly consorted with, while desperately looking for a way to stop the emergence of the psychic mutations that were threatening to destroy his legion. In an act of repentance and sacrifice, and to show his father that he and his legion were loyal to the end, he did not warn the defenders of the planet or his legion of the coming Imperial attack. On the contrary, he imposed a psychic veil on the planet so the Thousand Sons would have no clue of the impending assault. He also dispersed the Thousand Sons Legion fleet far away from Prospero. He knew that Tzeentch wanted the Thousand Sons and Space Wolves to slaughter each other, and he wanted to stop these plans, even if it meant the sacrifice of his legion and homeworld. Therefore, the Space Wolves' attack on the Thousand Sons' homeworld of Prospero came as a complete surprise. Because there was no warning, the invading fleet translated from the warp into real space practically on top of the planet, and quickly destroyed its orbital defenses, initiating the great campaign of the Horus Heresy known as the Fall of Prospero to Imperial historians. Then, a tremendous orbital bombardment reduced Prospero to cinders, except its capital, Tizca, a beautiful city and the seat of Magnus and the Legion that was at all times protected by a psychic void shield. This shield was maintained by one of the Thousand Sons cults, and Magnus did not disable it, knowing that such action would alert his legion. Because of the shield, an Imperial invasion of Tizca had to take place. A huge force of landing vehicles and support craft descended on the city, whose defenses had been left mostly unmanned. Establishing a beachhead in the spaceport area, the Space Wolves began slaughtering thousands of Prosperans and burning everything in sight. Yet, the Thousand Sons rank and file did not share Magnus's acceptance of defeat and punishment, so they took up arms against the Loyalist invaders. The Thousand Sons managed to hold Tizca, the only surviving city on the planet, for a period of time before they were eventually pushed back. Magnus eventually, reluctantly, took to the battle against the Loyalist forces when Leman Russ and his Wolfen were unleashed on the last standing pyramid of Tizca. Magnus and Leman Russ took part in a devastating duel in which Russ was ultimately victorious. Magnus invoked ancient sorceries in order to escape Prospero by opening a gateway through the warp into the Eye of Terror, where a demon world had been prepared for Magnus and the remnants of his legion by their new patron, Tzeentch. Magnus was subsequently rewarded by Tzeentch by being transformed into a demon prince. Following the siege of Prospero, the Thousand Sons have been the arch-enemies of the Space Wolves chapter. They have tried several times to uproot and destroy the Space Wolves, including establishing a Chaos Temple in a mountain spire on the Space Wolves' homeworld of Fenris, a temple to Tzeentch known as the Demon Spire, whose creation was ordered by Maddox, a high-ranking Chaos Space Marine in Magnus's service. The Thousand Sons tried again on the world of Garm by stealing the Space Wolves' artifact known as the Spear of Russ to perform a sorcerous ritual that would transform the planet into another demon world of the Warp. Even though the spear was lost, the world was saved from chaos and retaken for the Emperor by the Imperial Guard. In this instance, Ragnar Blackmane defeated Maddox and cast the spear into a partially manifested Magnus, losing the spear but banishing Magnus back to the Warp. Revenge for the Thousand Sons finally came against the Space Wolves in the 32nd millennium, even though most of those loyalist Astartes of that chapter who had originally fought against them had died and passed on long centuries before. The Thousand Sons began raiding worlds around Fenris, attempting to bait Great Wolf Harak Ironhelm away from his homeworld because he wanted nothing more than to bring the Thousand Sons to battle. Magnus even taunted him in his dreams, showing Harak the smoldering remains of conquered cities which Magnus was walking through. Eventually, Harak found what he believed to be the Thousand Sons' secret base on Gangava and launched a full-scale attack against it. This allowed the Thousand Sons to assault Fenris itself. For 40 days and nights, the Thousand Sons assaulted the Fang Citadel, and the defending Space Wolves were forced to awaken Bjorn the Fell-Handed, now a venerable dreadnought. The remaining Space Wolves' troops retreated deep into the Fang, while sending scouts out to escape and inform Harak. Harak returned to Fenris and brought the battle to Magnus. Magnus, now a demon prince, was too powerful for Harak, however, and slew him on the slopes of the Fang, but not before taking a terrible wound himself. When the Space Wolf chapter fleet returned, the Thousand Sons withdrew from Fenris back into the Warp, but were pleased at the death of the Space Wolves chapter master. Sometime later, the surviving Thousand Sons Marines began to suffer severely once more from the constant mutations of their genomes that were always a result of time exposed to the chaos energies of the Eye of Terror. In addition, the Thousand Sons' patron chaos power Tzeentch was the very embodiment of change, and he often gave mutational gifts to those who served him. Soon after their arrival in the Eye of Terror, several of the Thousand Sons' battle brothers were mutating out of control into mindless chaos spawn. All their medical efforts to staunch the spread of mutation were for naught. The Thousand Sons were losing the only thing they had left after the Horus Heresy and the destruction of Prospero, their humanity. When Rubric of Ahriman, the chief librarian of the Thousand Sons and longtime friend and advisor of Magnus the Red, saw the gene curse, known as the flesh change, of his fellow Thousand Sons manifest at the dawn of the Great Crusade, he vowed to find a way to halt its hideous rampage. When he witnessed his twin brother Ormuzd mutate into a mewling abomination, the vow to save his brethren became the defining core of Ahriman's being. The chief librarian turned his every waking moment to finding a solution to the flesh change. Ultimately, his single-minded crusade led to a kind of success, but also a terrible failure. During the Thousand Sons' exile to the planet of the Sorcerers, when they began to fall back into rampant mutation, Ahriman devised a way to prevent further mutation in the form of a powerful spell known as the Rubric of Ahriman. However, the rest of the sorcerer librarians of the Thousand Sons did not agree or see eye to eye on the matter. It was only when Magnus was finally elevated to the status of Demon Prince of Tzeentch that the Legion's sorcerers banded together to create a cabal. They agreed to cooperate and unleash the Rubric. The following sorcerous cataclysm unleashed lightning strikes that hit each and every Thousand Sons Chaos Marine. Those that had little or no psychic power were disintegrated outright, their bodies turning to ash within their armor. Those that possessed psychic power found those abilities greatly augmented, becoming among the most powerful sorcerers in the galaxy, yet their souls were fused with the very essence of their power armor as a result, creating a horrific, undying hybrid of man and machine. Magnus was about to destroy Ahriman and his Cabal for what they had done to his legion, but just as he was about to strike, the Cabal was saved by Tzeentch, who revealed, "You destroy my pawns too easily." Ahriman's Cabal were instead exiled from the Thousand Suns planet of sorcery for their actions by the demon prince Magnus the Red. Magnus cursed Ahriman to wander the galaxy in search of the true meaning of chaos. Instead, Ahriman now seeks out sacred artifacts and talented psychers to corrupt them to chaos and add them to the arsenal of the ruinous powers. The threat presented to the Imperium by the Cabal of Ahriman is so great that the Inquisition will sooner destroy a precious artifact than allow it to fall into Ahriman's hands. Despite the Inquisition's opposition, Ahriman has successfully wandered the galaxy, gathering up promising new cult members and artifacts on thousands of worlds for the last several millennia. Ever since casting that darkest and most powerful of spells, Ahriman has roamed the galaxy in search of eldritch power enough to make good his mistake. For the last few decades, he has been embroiled in a quest to locate and plunder the fabled Black Library of the Eldar, where the sum total of that ancient race's learnings about the forces of chaos are sealed away. During Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, Ahriman sought entry into the Black Library in a hidden branch of the Webway, the labyrinthine dimension that lies between reality and the warp. He was finally able to achieve this goal and gained access to the Webway by using the captured Inquisitor Chivak and a long-forgotten Webway portal on the world of Etiamnum III. It is rumored that if Ahriman was able to secure entry to the Black Library, he could use the information inside to become a new and powerful Chaos God. But truth, oftentimes, is much more mundane than one would want to believe. To achieve his aims, Ahriman fought through the Black Library's protectors and was able to get near enough to his destination, enabling him to project his astral form inside it, avoiding its strange guardians long enough to transcribe the fabled Tome Labyrinthus onto hermetic parchments of his own making. With this priceless manuscript at his command, Ahriman can now navigate long-lost sections of the Webway. After summoning Leviathan, a giant flying warp beast wreathed in flame, a cyclopean demonic monstrosity with screamers that follow in its wake, disrupting not only the warp but the Webway as well, and causing horrendous casualties on both sides of the conflict, Ahriman was ejected from the Webway. At the time, it was believed that his goal was unattained. Inquisitor Chivak was captured by the Eldar's Harlequins and is believed to be still held in the Webway. The Webway gate Ahriman used was later sealed by the Eldar, never to be opened again. With his ill-gotten copy of the Tome Labyrinthus in his hands, Ahriman can navigate his way through the Webway at will and reopen the many portals that are situated on worlds settled by the Imperium. Amongst these are ancient cairn gateways that lead onto the death world of Fenris, the home planet of the Space Wolves chapter, the ancient enemies of the Thousand Suns. With this knowledge, Ahriman has made himself vital to Magnus's plans once more, and vice versa. With Magnus the Red in Ahriman's debt, the arch-sorcerer would likely be able to invade the Black Library in earnest in search of the arcane cure he desires, to reverse the effects of the Rubric and turn his brothers back into beings of flesh, blood, and limitless mental potential. Ahriman himself believes to this day that chaos can be controlled and used effectively with enough strength of will to master its willful eddies and a powerful mind to focus its demands. While often portrayed as the hero of Tzeentch, he instead believes he is serving his own goals, despite being just a pawn of that mercurial god. He does not openly recognize the Changer of Ways as his master, though all his machinations by definition empower the Lord of Change. Prospero was chosen by its original settlers for one reason: its remoteness. Isolated from the most common imperial travel lanes and boasting virtually no independent resources of any value, Prospero had only one redeeming quality. It was a good place to hide. In the end, it was not even that. Today it is a blasted ruin, declared Purgatus by the Inquisition. Through the millennia of endless raiding since, it has been discerned the City of Light survived its transit through the Immaterium intact. It came to rest within the Eye of Terror, upon a world that has come to be known as the Planet of the Sorcerers. That demonic place is a seething cauldron of magical power, reflected across its breadth in the form of infernal volcanism and tempestuous skies saturated with magical vapor. Towers jut from craggy fists of rock thrust up from plains of lava, twisted and obscene mockeries of the spires and pyramids of learning which were the hallmarks of the City of Light before its fall. Mightiest of them all is the obsidian monolith that is the Tower of the Cyclops, said to be so massive it can be discerned from space with the naked eye. More obscenely, the Tower of the Cyclops looks back, as the pinnacle of the obelisk is a glowing warp eye through which Magnus watches the paths of the future. The silver towers of the City of Light have been transfigured by the sorcerous might of the Thousand Suns into spacefaring fortresses in which Psyker lords set out from the planet of sorcerers to traverse the cosmos, launching vengeful assaults upon the Imperium of Man, the Organization of the Thousand Suns. Before the coming of Magnus the Red is not currently known, but it is recorded that they were not considered particularly different from the organization of a typical Astartes legion, apart from their unusually high number of battle brothers that possessed psychic abilities which resulted in the legion possessing the most powerful librarians during that era. When Magnus took over command of the Thousand Suns, he instituted organizational and hierarchical changes within his legion. Line officers included the sergeants who led a squad analog unit called a chantry, and lieutenants, junior centurions, and captains, senior centurions, who served as the sub-commanders and commanders, respectively, of a company analog unit called a circle. Legion officers of higher rank, including consuls and praetors, commanded one of the 9 fellowships that Togthur comprised the entirety of the legion. The Thousand Suns also utilized a unique and impenetrable chain of command derived from the Hermetic teachings of Magnus the Red, wherein officers held multiple ranks in overlapping tiers of seniority and specialization, including those of fellowship, order, and cult. Units known as chapters in some of the other legions, which contained approximately 1,000 Astartes, were now referred to as fellowships within the Thousand Suns. The highest number of fellowships the Thousand Suns were able to field when they rebuilt the legion following the return of the Primarch was 10. However, at the conclusion of the particularly bloody Kamenka Troika campaign, where the Thousand Suns had lost nearly 900 Astartes, this effectively wiped out an entire fellowship. Rather than rebuild the decimated fellowship, Magnus decided to reorganize and maintain the legion with only 9 fellowships. This organization was referred to as the Pesajet. The legion's command structure was adapted in accordance with Prosperine philosophy and were now known as the Rahati, or the Coven of Magnus, a secondary command track in which the legion's senior officers were ranked according to psychic ability and influence. As part of their training, all captains of a fellowship undertook a secondment to another Space Marine Legion to learn its ways and further the Thousand Suns' understanding of the galaxy in their pursuit of knowledge. Calophus had served with the Iron Warriors, a legion he admired and ranked second only to the Thousand Suns. Phocis Takar fought alongside the Luna Wolves and never tired of regaling his brothers with tales of meeting Horus Lupercal or boasting of his close friendship with Hastur Sejanus and Ezekiel Abaddon, the first Primarch's closest lieutenants. Hathor Mat's secondment had seen him serving with the Emperor's children in their earliest days as they fought alongside the Luna Wolves. As Hathor Mat told of his experience to his fellow captains, he had caught the Phoenician's eye with his perfectly molded features and had fought within his sight on many an occasion. Mat's proudest possession was an oath of moment carved by Fulgrim and fixed to his breastplate as he took his leave to return to Prospero. Uthizar's secondment had been amongst the shortest ever served, lasting a little less than a Terran year with the Space Wolves. Ahriman had spent 5 standard years with the Word Bearers, learning much of their legion and methods of war. Magnus placed great faith in his subordinates, believing he had taught them well, that their powerful sorceries gave them the necessary tools to function independently of him. Before the Horus Heresy, individual Thousand Sons squads were not led by veteran sergeants, but by those who showed the most psychic promise. These thrall wizards were apprenticed to more experienced sorcerers for their Kabbalistic training, but at the same time gained experience leading their fellow warriors in small units. While this practice meant it was rare for 1,000 Sons Astartes who did not possess some measure of psychic talent to become a ranking officer, it also meant those sorcerers who did gain prominence had considerable combat experience. As a result, the 1,000 Sons, a numerically small legion to begin with, rarely took to the field en masse. Instead, they campaigned in smaller detachments under the command of sorcerers who often acted with much more authority independent of their Primarch than the officers of other legions. This past command experience has stood them in good stead as independent leaders of Chaos Space Marine warbands since the end of the Heresy, to the Imperium's considerable and continuing misfortune. The cults of the 1,000 Sons represented sub-formations composed of potent psychers within the 16th Legion who organizatio in certain psychic and sorcerous disciplines during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy eras. The 1,000 Sons, like some of their fellow independent-minded Astartes legions, employed a non-standard organization within the 18th Legion that were known as cults, and into which every Astartes was placed based upon their level of psychic ability. Though some 1,000 Sons Astartes never developed any measurable amount of psychic ability after being implanted with the Exolf Legion's gene seed, the majority did develop some form of psychic power, just like their Primarch Magnus the Red, soon after completing the transformation process. The Legion used 5 different cults to develop and improve the abilities of the often powerful psychers found amidst this Legion's ranks. Membership within these cults was determined regardless of the fellowship, chapter, to which each Astartes belonged within the Legion, since cult membership was based upon the psychic ability for which 1,000 Sons Astartes displayed the most affinity. Each fellowship of the 1,000 Sons was usually made up of Astartes, coming from all 5 of the cults within the Echtean Legion, though it was not unheard of for a fellowship's membership to be dominated by the members of just one of the cults. These 5 cults had been founded within the Legion by the 9 original members of Magnus the Red's inner circle or Cabal, who were collectively known as the Rehati. The Rehati had each earned mastery in one of the 5 psychic disciplines recognized by the Legion and most other scholars of sorcery. Each cult was formed to further the development of one of the recognized psychic aptitudes. The Athenians focused on telepathy, the Corvidae sought to develop their precognitive abilities, the Pavoni learned to make use of physiokinesis, the mental manipulation of one's own physiological processes, the Pyrae plumbed the secrets of fire, a discipline called pyrokinesis, and the Raptora mastered the potent power of telekinesis. The leader of each cult bore the rank of Magister Templi. The leader of all the cults was known as the Magus, and this was a rank exclusively held by the Echtean Legion's Primarch, Magnus the Red. The highest rank within the cult system was that of Ipisumus, a grade which represented a being free from limitations, who lives in balance with the corporeal and incorporeal universe. For all intents and purposes, the Ipisumus was the most perfect being in the universe. This esteemed rank was represented by the most powerful human psyker in existence, the Emperor of Mankind. On the 1,000 Sons lost homeworld of Prospero, in the capital city of Tizca, each cult maintained its own pyramidal headquarters, which served as both a repository of the arcane knowledge that they had collected about their chosen psychic disciplines from across the galaxy, as well as training facilities specifically geared towards enhancing psychers who displayed strength in one of the 5 recognized psychic disciplines. Each of these pyramids' front gates was topped by the great golden icon that represented the cult, save for the pyramid of the Pyre cult, which was topped by an ever-burning flame and whose gate was guarded by Canis Vertex, a warlord-class battle titan of the Legio Astorum that would see action during the burning of Prospero. To further represent the distinctiveness of the cult's members, the Astartes from each cult would display the cult's insignia upon the shoulder plates of their power armor, with the cult's distinctive icon placed within the center of the 16th Legion's Pre-Heresy Legion badge as displayed above. It is currently unknown what happened to the cults of the Thousand Sons Legion in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy and their transformation into a traitor legion of Tzeentch, as well as the vast changes wrought in the 15th Legion by the Rubric of Ahriman. It can be assumed that the same range of basic psychic powers not only still exists among the Thousand Sons, but has probably been greatly enhanced by their residence within the Eye of Terror and their innate connection to the Lord of Change. Following the end of the Horus Heresy, proper hierarchical structure within the 16th Legion squads and fellowships, chapters, disintegrated, as was common in most of the traitor legions, as the more deleterious effects of chaos manifested with the end of the unity between the forces of chaos after the Siege of Terra. In the wake of the fall of Prospero, the organization of the Thousand Sons Legion is based around the number 9, the sacred number of Tzeentch. The 9 cults of the Thousand Sons are each ruled by a powerful demon prince or exalted sorcerer who bears the ancient rank of Magister Templi. Together with their most powerful sorceress followers, they form a group known as the Rehati. Within each cult are a number of arcane ranks. A fundamental principle of the Thousand Sons organization remains the arrangement of 9 lesser sorcerers beneath a psychic potentate. This practice has its roots in the first Cabal of Magnus. At the core of the war assemblies of the Thousand Sons are the Thrall Bands. These primarily consist of a Chaos champion known as a Magister and up to 9 thralls, each a lesser sorcerer champion of Tzeentch. This Kabbalistic gathering usually manifests as an exalted sorcerer and 9 aspiring sorcerers, or Scarab occult sorcerers, who lead the Rubric Marines and Scarab occult Terminators into battle. In the rarest of thrall bands, the thralls might instead be powerful sorcerers or exalted sorcerers themselves. Whatever the individual might of the thralls, the conjunction of 9 lesser champions of Tzeentch bolsters the sorceress powers of their magister to truly inhuman levels. The exalted sorcerers and demon princes who rule the Silver Towers each command many of these thrall bands, which may be gathered together into 100-strong task forces called Exalted Thrall Bands. Their followers comprise the raiding forces through which Tzeentch enacts some of his most violent schemes upon the galaxy. While the war bands of Tzeentch's champions manifest in countless ways, the sorceress thrall bands of the Thousand Sons are the most favored by the Changer of the Ways. Each thrall band is bolstered by the mutated warrior auxiliaries of the planet of sorcerers, or by chaos cultist forces drawn from the Imperium. In addition, the Legion maintains a small number of battle tanks and demon engines. Some Adeptus Astartes equipment is captured during their raids, but as very few of those weapons or vehicles are properly maintained, they rarely last for long, and so are never numerous. Those Thousand Sons who took their Legion's fate unbidden and helped work the arcane Rubric of Ahriman earned their Primarch's wrath and were banished forevermore to the far reaches of the galaxy. These exiles formed into sorceress warbands of Chaos Space Marines of varying size and composition, led by exalted sorcerers, those exiles who have stalked the galaxy for 10 millennia, whose lips uttered the dread spell that doomed so many of the Thousand Sons to an eternity of dust. The Thousand Sons Legion is divided into 9 great cults. At the head of each is a member of the Rehati, who bears the ancient rank of Magister Templi. Beneath each Magister Templi are 9 other demon princes and sorcerers who, though lesser in rank, still bear much of Tzeentch's favor. These 9 steer the cult along the ever-changing paths of fate. Other sorcerers hold lower positions in the cult and along with troops, tanks, mutants, and demon engines, are capable of claiming vast swaths of real space for their cult masters. Each cult has worlds from which they draw resources and magical energy, and populous planets to provide them with constant streams of cultist soldiers, slaves, and subjects for their arcane experiments. Aside from constituting a terrifying military force, each of the cults is an amalgam of the twisted minds of those in its ranks, and though inherently self-serving, the members of a given cult are ultimately bent towards the same purpose. To a mortal mind, untouched by Tzeentch's corruptions, the complex plans laid out by these cults are utterly unfathomable, but to the Thousand Sons they are both a form of profane worship and a route to vengeance over the Imperium. Often, the goals of a given cult will undermine or even contradict those of the other cults. As such, the cults are wary of one another, and alliances between them are ever shifting. The power and influence of each is also in constant flux, with every cult going through cycles of activity and torpidity as befits their inscrutable machinations. It is extremely rare for the entirety of a cult to deploy in a single war zone, though when this does happen, the fabric of reality quakes in their presence. More often, the cult's malevolent goals require its forces to be spread throughout space and time, allowing each splinter to play a separate role in some larger and more sinister stratagem. A cult, therefore, comprises many sects, each of which may prosecute their own seemingly unconnected campaigns of terror. Where the combined forces of a cult could easily set a whole star system ablaze, a single sect is still capable of devastating a planet. Often, several sects will launch simultaneous strikes across large tracts of real space, plunging entire Imperial subsectors into disarray and panic. As nearby worlds send reinforcements to the embattled planets, more Thousand Sons appear to attack where defenses have been stretched to the breaking point. Devastating as they are, these attacks rarely give any clue as to the ultimate goals of the cult. A Thousand Sons sect is made up of multiple thrall bands, similar to the war bands of other heretic Astartes forces, which can also act independently of each other. With several units of Thousand Sons bolstered by auxiliary troops and vehicles, a single thrall band can obliterate an enemy fortress or turn a city into a blazing pyre. A number of thrall bands operate in complete isolation from the larger legion. Some have been exiled from the planet of the sorcerers, while others chose to leave to pursue their own ends. But even these forces ultimately serve the goals of one of the 9 cults of the Legion, whether they themselves know it or not. The Thousand Sons are known not only for their intricate battle stratagems and the destructive sorceries they unleash upon their enemies. Their armor and heraldry is also instantly recognizable, and the Legion marches to war bearing the symbols of their Prosperine heritage alongside runes and sigils devoted to Tzeentch. Aside from the slavering throngs of Chaos cultists and Zangors, the bulk of a Thousand Sons thrall band is composed of Rubric Marines. These warriors tower over mortal humans on the battlefield, and with lifeless, warp-driven movements they march inexorably through all but the most punishing fire. Their armor is irreplaceable, for each suit was fused with the essence of the warrior inside by the Rubric of Ahriman. However, any given Rubric Marine may have been felled in battle dozens or even hundreds of times, his essence inevitably restored once again to his armor by a sorceress master to fight in another campaign of horror. As such, the armor of the Rubrici is both a grim reminder of the devastation done unto the Legion and the means by which the Thousand Sons wreak their vengeance upon the Imperium of Man. The Rubrici in a given thrall band, along with the sorcerers and Sekhmet warriors who march to battle with them, are all adorned in the colors and symbols of their magister, with additional iconography on the armor and tabard. These icons have various and often simultaneous meanings, with some denoting the aspiring sorcerer to whom a Rubric Marine is enthralled, and others recording a lost piece of Prosperine lore. The XTth Legion was initially created from Terran stock. After his genetic sons of the XTth Legion were reunited with their Primarch, Magnus the Red's pact with Tzeentch was sealed, Only 1 in 1,000 battle brothers were spared from the further corruption of the flesh change. Throughout the rest of the Great Crusade, the Legion recruited exclusively from Prospero, despite the fact that the isolated world possessed only a small population with low genetic diversity. Though new recruits were only culled for the Legion in small numbers, many of them were psychically gifted. This resulted in the Thousand Sons being a smaller legion than was common amongst their fellow Astartes. Currently, it is unknown how the Legion is able to maintain its current strength. It was once observed that the Legion has performed what appeared to be some sort of resurrection ritual for a slain Thousand Son Astartes. This magical conjuration allowed the 16th Legion's Chaos Sorcerers to summon the spirits of deceased Thousand Sons from the warp so they could possess a mortal body. The Sorcerers were able to use either a living body or a deceased shell for the embodiment of the dead souls. It made no particular difference for the ritual which was used, as both were effective. These newly possessed bodies then transformed into reborn Thousand Sons battle brothers, maintaining the always small numbers of the Exinthi Legion even after their fall to chaos. The pre-Prosperine panoply of the original 16th Legion cannot be more in contrast to the form which it was later to take, its coloration and armorials echoing that of both the pre-unification techno-barbarian Achaemenid Empire and the Noahion witchmark of Old Terra, centered above a lapis blue-colored M. The M most likely represented the ancient Romanii numeral that stood for 1,000, which represented the Legion's name and the original number of Astartes raised for the 16th Legion, most of whom had been handpicked by the Emperor himself. This number also later reflected the number of Magnus's gene sons who survived his cure for the horrible flesh change when they finally reunited with their Primarch on the world of Prospero. Others were eventually recruited during the course of the Great Crusade, swelling the ranks of the Thousand Sons well beyond their eponymous number. Space Marine legions usually comprised at a minimum 10,000 active Astartes. Like many of their contemporaries whose numbers grew over the centuries of the Great Crusade, the Thousand Sons were no different, eventually swelling to 80,000, 90,000 Astartes at the height of the Imperium's expansion before the Horus Heresy. This was true despite the loss of so many of their original complement to the flesh change, before Magnus found a way to cure his sons of their affliction. After the Thousand Sons were united with Magnus and relocated to Prospero, he changed the badge of the 16th Legion into a solar glyph, which became the Thousand Sons' official armorial icon and the precursor to the Traitor Legion's more elaborate post-heresy badge. Following the Horus Heresy, the Thousand Sons' iconography changed to that of the Ouroboros, an ancient Terran symbol depicting a serpent or dragon eating its own tail. The Ouroboros often represents self-reflexivity or cyclicality, especially in the sense of something constantly recreating itself, the eternal return, and other things perceived as cycles that begin anew as soon as they end. Thousand Sons sect icons are commonly worn on the right pauldron, whilst the left bears the sigil of the Thousand Sons Legion as a whole. Sect symbols are multifarious in their shape and meaning, with some mirroring the symbol of Tzeentch, others the single eye of Magnus, and others still some long-forgotten Prosperine icon. Regardless of their sect or thrall band, almost all Thousand Sons bear the sigil of the flaming worm devouring its own tail, a corrupted version of their original Legion icon that is rich in symbolism. It is common practice to use combinations of runes to further identify thrall bands, squads, and even individual battle brothers. The housing that frames each identifying pauldron image also has meaning, further identifying the squads within a thrall band. To one schooled in symbology, the history and allegiance of each Thousand Sons warrior becomes clear at a glance. Icons commonly used by the Thousand Sons include variations of their corrupted Legion icon and runes associated with the Chaos god Tzeentch. Representations of the numbers 1 to 10 are also employed, inscribed in inks made from rare and often magically potent ingredients by the sorceress masters of each Rubricae squad. The color of each Rubricae's tabard often identifies his squad, but may also tie him to his thrall band. Every Rubrici within a thrall band will bear one or more recognition runes upon his tabard. Battle Brothers might bear additional runes, signifying enchantments, curses, or the spirit warrior's name. Squads of Scarab occult terminators carry the same runes as the Rubrici squads of their thrall bands. A sorcerer may mark out his direct servants with symbols or adornments upon their pauldrons. The complex geometric symbols once worn by the seers and scholars of Tizca live on in the iconography of the Thousand Suns. Each sigil has many potential meanings. Though their forms remain the same as the original rune, the intent behind them has changed. For instance, a fire symbol that was once born to represent sunrise would now be interpreted as the killing flame. The Dark Tongue is a ritual language, and its phonetic runes are the only manner in which the mysteries of chaos can be truly expressed. It is the language of demons and chaos creatures with the power of speech. The Thousand Suns strive to learn this arcane language for the conjuration of chaos entities and to bargain with demons when they are summoned. The vehicles utilized by the Thousand Suns often bear mystical symbols. Some of these merely echo the thrall band-specific heraldry of those inside. Others bind demonic entities into the metallic fabric of the vehicles, entrapping them in its mystical urn. Such armored assets have an aggressive spirit that drives it to ram, grind, and crush.